for joining us for this webinar with Jim Zogby to talk about the DNC's platform for the 2020 election. Jim is the founder and president of the Arab American Institute, a DC-based organization that serves as a political and policy research arm for the Arab American community. There is so much to say about Jim and what he has done in his career for Palestinian rights and for the Arab American community, but I will speak to just a few of the things. Jim is an author and scholar and expert on Middle East issues. He has testified before congressional committees, participated in executive branch forums, working with previous presidents. He has addressed the United Nations. In 2013, he was appointed to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom by then President Barak Obama. From 2001 all the way through 2017, he was a member of the Executive Committee of the Democratic National Committee. He worked on the 2016 DNC Platform to push the platform to support Palestinian rights. He's the author of several books, including What Ethnic Americans Really Think About and What Arabs Think, Values, Beliefs, and Concerns. Welcome, Jim. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ariel.
So I know we're going to be talking about the 2020 DNC platform, but I wanted to start by going back to 2016 and ask you what it was like to work on the DNC platform then and what that process entailed.
Well, in 2016, it was a bit of deja vu because I'd been working on platforms going back to the 80s, and it was fascinating that in 88, when I was Jesse Jackson, one of his representatives to platform, working with the Dukakis people, it was actually some of the very same people who were across from me now representing the Hillary Clinton campaign. And it was the same problem. The reality had moved in a certain direction back in 2008. I'm sorry, in 88, it was the Intifada and public opinion was shifting in the country. A poll had shown that 71% of Democrats would have supported the platform plank that Jackson wanted to introduce. But the Dukakis people went wild when we said mutual recognition, territorial compromise, and self-determination. They said, this will destroy the Democratic Party. And do you want that on your head, Zogby? When we came back with a compromise and we said, okay, look, if you're not going to give, and Jesse would prefer to avoid a fight if at all possible, how about this? The platform said something about Camp David. So remember, this is 88, and it was, much earlier period. And so we said, how about just saying legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and land for peace? We could maybe work with that. The response was, if the P word even appears in the platform, all hell will break loose. The P word being Palestinian. They drew a red line, and it was like a show of strength and resolve. They weren't going to give, even if it was irrational. They weren't going to give. So we went and had our debate. I spoke from the podium of the convention, and all hell did break loose, but not because we raised it, but because Chuck Schumer followed, and he was so insulting and demeaning that people started booing him. Flash forward 2016, same people from the Clinton campaign, same issues. They drew red lines in bizarre places. One of the red lines was they wouldn't let the word occupation be in the platform. Another one was they wouldn't let the word settlements be in the platform. They wanted Jerusalem in the platform. And at one point they said, when we talked about settlements, they said, no, you can't bring settlements in because that's a final status issue according to Oslo. And we can't predetermine the status of final status issues. I said, all right, then what about Jerusalem? That's a final status issue and you just predetermined it. Well, they My brother had a crude expression. He used to say, you'd hear their assholes clamp shut. Like they were mortified that, we'd caught them in this bizarre contradiction. But the result was that they just, they swallow their pride, they draw these red lines, and they go forward with them. And that's pretty much what it was like in 16. They were not giving an inch on anything, and so we basically we left with no victories at all on this issue. Yeah.
Now, fast forward 4 years later, and here we are again. A draft of the 2020 platform hasn't been officially released, but pro-Israel groups, apartheid apologist groups, have leaked parts of the platform and are celebrating that. Again, it does not have the word occupation. And they consider this an enormous win for the 2020 platform. I'm wondering first if you can bring us up to speed about what we know about the 2020 platform and if there are things in it that we should feel good about.
Yeah, look, many of us were involved in conversations with the drafters, and it was in confidence, and we were asked to maintain confidence about the draft, and I did. But then I pick up a copy of the Jewish Insider, and Democrats Majority for Israel, they came out with the language. Victory, we won. It's not Bernie, it's Biden. And I thought about it. Number one, they broke trust. But number two, why did they break trust? And then I started thinking about it. It was because they needed to spin a win. They needed to make this platform their victory. Why? Because they've been losing everywhere. 190 plus members of Congress coming out opposed to annexation. Some members of Congress and the Senate now proposing putting financial conditions on Israel if they annex. They clearly lost with the Eliot Engel race. They're going to get their heads handed to them and a couple of others, and they need to look tough. Because, like Donald Trump, they can never admit defeat. They always have to be invincible. And so we won the platform, but they didn't win the platform. Look, the platform says the very same language about BDS that it said in 2016, that they oppose efforts to delegitimize Israel, whether at the United Nations or through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That was exactly the language. Back in 16, we wanted to have a free speech exception. They wouldn't do it. This year's platform has a comma, and it says, while we respect the First Amendment rights of every American to free speech, something like that. That's the same as if in the Republican Party platform, they had a plank that said, we are steadfastly opposed to abortion, comma, but every woman has the right to choose. Basically, the second clause nullifies the first clause, so that what in effect the Democratic Party platform is saying is, every one of those states that have passed anti-BDS laws, they're unconstitutional. They've exactly taken the position of the ACLU. ACLU says it personally doesn't support BDS, but it's every American's constitutional right to do it. And I frankly can live with that. There's another clause that I love. It's Democrats affirm the equal worth, something like that, of Israelis and Palestinians alike. That may not sound like a lot, but if you look at previous platforms, anything equalizing the human worth of both Israelis and Palestinians. Remember, a couple decades ago, I couldn't get the P word in the platform. Now they're equal human beings to Israelis. And what follows from that is a whole lot that I think is important. There is a statement of opposing settlement expansion, and I appreciate that. But we've been telling Israel don't expand settlements for 50 years, and they just keep doing it. Camp David, it was 120,000 settlers. Today, it's 650,000 settlers in the West Bank. And all the time we've been telling them don't do it. It's as if, it's like a parent with a spoiled child. You tell the kid don't do it, they do it, no consequence, they do it again. we would like the word expansion taken out, and we would like some conditionality, some consequences. There have to be consequences on bad behavior. Every other country in the world lives with consequences but Israel. And they accuse us of singling Israel out for criticism. It's the other way around. They're singling Israel out as the one country you can't criticize. And that's unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. So there are some positive things in the platform. There are some weaknesses in the platform. And we think, frankly, that the positives only bring the platform up to about a 20-year-ago statement, right? It's still not caught up with where reality is today. And it's clearly not caught up with where democratic public opinion is today.
So we at CODEPINK have also been part of that communication with the Biden campaign to talk about the 2020 platform. We were invited to discuss this with them after we released a letter signed by over 100 US organizations calling on the Biden campaign as well as the Trump campaign to have a principled foreign policy towards Israel and the Palestinian struggle. And unlike the Democratic majority for Israel, we also kept that conversation in confidence. And one of the things that we called for in that letter is that BDS be recognized as a protected form of free speech. So this actually feels kind of big, especially after all the criminalizing of BDS.
When Ilhan and Rashida were first elected, remember there was an effort to pass the anti-BDS bill in the House, and it was made BDS is anti-Semitism. That was how it was framed. It was framed that way. They could not do it. They couldn't do it. I mean, the very presence of Rashida and Ilhan changed the character of the debate in Congress, and progressives in Congress were not going to go with it. It's the same thing right now. They can't do it, number one, because it's unconstitutional, and number two, because they know that the Democratic base would not tolerate it. So it was interesting. In 2016, I remember the discussion really well because one of the people for the Clinton side, when I objected to the BDS on free speech issues, they came back with, well, that's not what we mean. We mean only efforts that delegitimize Israel. I mean, if you're freely operating in a way to declare your, they were like twisting themselves in knots, trying to explain that their opposition to BDS was only if it delegitimized Israel. So I said, I'm not delegitimizing Israel. Israel's delegitimizing itself. I mean, I'm not the one who is doing the things that incur the wrath of the international community and violate international law. I'm not the one who's committing these atrocities. And I'm simply pointing them out. That's not delegitimizing Israel. And I'm saying I don't want to deal with them if they do it. So they actually were trying to talk their way out of this back in 2016. Now they've actually done it. They've come full circle on it. And they now actually have said, we oppose it, but there's a free speech exception. It's a win. And the other side can never admit that we won anything or that we can pocket a victory, that they've lost something. But frankly, they did. And they're losing every day. And I think it's just, it's makes me feel pretty good. Now, do I think that they will not try to come back at the convention like they did with the Jerusalem thing back in 2012 and try to undo it? But oh man, if they did, there'd be holy hell to pay. Can you imagine them trying to strike out every American has the right to free speech from the platform? I mean, now that it's in, there's no going back on this one, or else it's a huge embarrassment.
It's been just about a year since Ilhan Omar released legislation to recognize boycotts as a protected form of free speech. And one of the most astounding things about her resolution, it was July of 2019, was that it was supported as an original co-sponsor by Representative John Lewis, civil rights icon who just passed. So this conversation around boycotts being a protected form of free speech that can't be outlawed has really progressed over time. And in fact, American opinion has really changed over time. And that's how we've accomplished this. But we've gone through the good. So let's now talk about the bad and the ugly in the 2020 draft.
You got a specific question, or do you want me to just go for it?
Oh, I was just going to let you go for it.
Well,
what upsets you in that draft?
Well, I mean, clearly the inability to mention the word occupation. I think that the failure to put conditions on any Israeli behavior. Those, I think, are the two things. Look, I can live with the unbreakable, unshakable, unbendable, all of that, the sort of the exaggerated love language that has to be thrown into these things. I can live with that. I think it's embarrassing a little bit. It ought to be embarrassing. And I think, when we, decades from now, we'll look back at it and we'll say, oh my God, why were they saying stuff like that? I mean, what other countries do we have unbreakable, unshakable, sounds like a 1950s really corny rock love song, but I can live with that stuff. It's unbecoming, but they always feel a need to do it. Do they mean it? I have no idea of reading their minds. I have a club, I call it the I'm Really With You Guys But Club. It includes all those members of Congress who've said to me at one time or another, yeah, I'm really with you guys. I really get your stuff, but I can't do it because you know how they are. I mean, there's kind of an anti-Semitic undertone to it. You know what the Jews are like. I mean, actually, some of them have said that to me, and I'll turn around and say there's an anti-Semite in the room, and it's not me, it's you. But that mindset of needing to pay homage to Israel in this kind of really excessive and obsessive way. It's part of platform language. Again, I just think it's unbecoming, but it's there. The rest of the platform is actually soppy, and it's, like I said, it's like 20 years behind the times. It just doesn't recognize the existing reality of 650,000 settlers. I mean, to say that they want a two-state solution is nice, but that's even 30 years behind the times. I mean, how do you, if you are not going to get rid of 650,000 settlers, if you're not going to put sanctions on Israeli behavior that's created this problem in the first place, how do you create a viable, contiguous Palestinian state, which is what they say their aspiration is? And 30 years ago, it would have been great if they'd taken that position. Today, I don't know how you get there. Would I like to see Palestinians independent? Absolutely. But I got to figure out how do you get those settlers out of the territories? And I frankly don't think that the platform addresses any of that. It's a wish list. We oppose settlement expansion. We oppose annexation. We want a two-state solution, but we're not going to give you a clue how we're going to get there. And that part of it is that's the weak part, because Israel pockets our objection and proceeds to do what they want to do, and we are where we are.
One of the things that Israel and the Trump administration, unlike the Democrats, do is they tell you how they're going to get there. They tell you how Trump's peace plan lays out how Israel is going to formalize apartheid and deny borders, diplomatic rights, all kinds of things to the supposed Palestinian state that they're never going to grant, and they lay it right out. Yeah. You mentioned AIPAC, and you were just interviewed by Philip Weiss of Mondoweiss about the Democratic platform, and you said in that interview, which is published on Mondoweiss's website, and I encourage everyone to check it out, you described AIPAC as being like the NRA in that they don't allow shifts in debate, but in this case, it's gotten away from AIPAC. And can you elaborate?
Yeah. You know, I remember the NRA several years ago, state of Virginia passed a law that you proposed a law that you could only purchase one gun a month. And the NRA went, you know, crazy. It's a violation of constitutional rights, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, buying 12 guns a year, that's a lot of guns. And, you know, over the span of maybe 40 years, it's a hell of a lot of guns. But the NRA could not allow that leak in the dike of their absolute control over the debate to take place. AIPAC does the same thing. They will not allow any criticism, any sign of weakness, any sign of sort of falling back from the unbreakable, unshakable, unbendable relationship, and no questioning allowed. When they had to issue a statement giving permission to members of Congress to come out against annexation, that was a huge defeat on their part. They could not, they would never have done that before. They would have threatened punishment for anyone who dared speak out against the policies of the government of Israel. But three things have happened. One is Benjamin Netanyahu, who has incurred the wrath of Democrats literally across the board. I mean, when his opposition to Barack Obama became so intense that Republicans invited him to Congress to humiliate their own president, that took a toll. When his policies continued to violate human rights across the board and people saw it, and then when he became wed to Donald Trump, and it was kind of this virtual marriage of two authoritarians, Democrats literally split apart from Republicans on the question of Israel, because Israel's led by this guy who is so antithetical to everything that we stand for. The other factor is that, and I look at polls this way, you know, we talk about a partisan divide. It's really not a partisan divide as much as it is a demographic divide. You have white, evangelical, sort of right-wing Christians on one side. It's about 40% of the Republican vote right now. And on the other side, you have young people, millennials, and then you have Blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans. And you put that together and you look at the polls, it's almost like gay marriage was 20 years ago. It's like Democrats 65-35 favorable, Republicans 35-65 unfavorable. That's how the Middle East looks when you look at the polls. Why? Because the demographics of both what are called Democrats and Republicans, the demographic identification has shifted completely. And why is that? In part because millennials have a global consciousness that their older age cohorts don't have. They have more passports per capita. They've traveled to more countries per capita. They log on to sites that take them all over the world, and their older counterparts don't do that. They're focused more on local. You ask a millennial, when in polling questions, my brother used to say, how do you most identify? And millennials, more than any other age cohort, would tend to identify as part of the world community, as part of planet Earth. Patriotism to a 70-year-old like me is putting on a uniform, or that some people in my age cohort, putting on a uniform and saluting the flag. But to millennials, patriotism is picking up litter. It's respecting civil rights. It's being respectful of people who have different gender orientation or different sexual orientation. I mean, this is an entirely different group of people who have a very different worldview. And they are, incidentally, very pro-Palestinian and very respectful of human rights. And so AIPAC is losing the ground because they're losing those constituents. Oh, yes, they can trot out an African-American member of Congress and say, he's with us 100%, we control, whatever, or a Latino member of Congress, but they're losing that constituency in public opinion. And some of those members of Congress are completely out of touch with where their own communities are on this issue. So that's what's happening. AIPAC is losing ground. I put it this way. Sometimes I say they control the hill, but we're gaining ground on all the positions around the hill. And so they have Pyrrhic victories, where they actually win a vote in Congress, but they're losing the debate in the country.
So you answered one of the questions that was in the chat asking about whether AIPAC still has a hold on the Democrats. And I like your description that they still control the Hill, but not the rest of the party. But they're even losing control of the Hill in many ways. Yeah. And I think the best example of this is Eliot Engel's loss, massive loss in his race. And if you could talk about this, as well as the fact that losing that race doesn't just mean Eliot Engel is out, but it means that one of the most important positions in Congress, the chair of House Foreign Affairs Committee, is now up for grabs. So if you could talk about that process of Engel losing and what it means and what we might see for the next chairperson.
For decades now, that committee has been the resting place of, it's where AIPAC sort of most members of Congress didn't want to get on the Foreign Affairs Committee. It was like, I don't want to get there because I know what's going to happen when I get there, the pressure I'll be under to deal with this thing. I mean, when Israel's getting the lion's share of foreign aid, when it's not, they talk about the UN having all these bills that are anti-Israel. They don't tell you about the sheer number of bizarre bills focused on Israel in the Congress. I mean, literally every agency of government has a little cutaway in education, in agriculture, in commerce, and all those for a little cutaway for Israel. And these guys know that, so they don't want to be on that committee. It's like it's the booby prize, unless you're like Eliot Engel, and you figure that's your ticket to stardom. That's your guarantee to be in Congress forever because they'll continue to support me if I get on that committee. I remember Steve Solars, who someone will remember was one of the leading members of the Foreign Affairs Committee. In 1982, he sent a fundraising email out to his constituents saying, when I was first elected, I promised you, it was to his Jewish donors constituent base is what I meant. He said, well, I first promised you that I would do everything I could for Israel. You helped me that year and raised $200,000 for my campaign. You know what I did? I helped increase aid to Israel $2 billion over what President what was going to do, and that's the success of you supporting me. For every dollar you give me, I've increased it that much for Israel. Well, I mean, if you'd said that about any other country, you would be like, literally drummed out of Congress. But that was acceptable behavior. And so many guys who got on the Foreign Affairs Committee got it because that was why they were going to do it. Eliot Engel's one of those people, not the brightest bulb in the chandelier, and somebody who actually served the job he was to play and served it well. And he just got bounced, and now there's a fight to who's going to take over. And Brad Sherman, who was cut of the same mold as Eliot Engel, claims seniority. But then you have Representative Castro, who is fascinating. I mean, here's somebody running for Foreign Affairs Committee chair saying that I want to be chair because too many voices have been excluded. Palestinian voices have been excluded from our discussions. I mean, that's the very fact that somebody can run for the Foreign Affairs Committee position, right, and say that is indicative of the change that's taking place in the politics in Congress. It's a big deal. I hope Castro wins. I don't know how the thing will play out in the Democratic caucus, but I think it's a very big deal that he has the guts to say something like that. And of course, he's speaking the truth because Palestinian voices aren't heard. They are excluded from the discussions. but it's important that it's now being talked about.
I want to mention a quote that Castro just put out related to his running for the Foreign Affairs chair. He said, "Foreign policy has been dominated by military and other coercive tools like sanctions." And then he said, "The primary victims abroad are civilians whom we should be seeking to empower, not impoverish." Now, Castro doesn't have the best voting record in terms of funding the Pentagon, but it seems that he is now being pushed to the left as well and is embracing that progressive stance, speaking out against sanctions, speaking out for Palestinian rights. And we have a question in the chat about what folks can do. So before we start to wind down, I want to direct folks to codepink.org/DNC 2020 platform. And that's a petition asking the DNC, calling on the DNC to name and condemn occupation in the platform. And I also want to direct folks to the sign-on letter that CODEPINK put out, laying out what a principled and just foreign policy towards Israel and supporting the Palestinian struggle would look like. And that's at codepink.org/Dear Joe Biden. So as we start to wind down, I want to, and I could go on for so much longer, but I know we said a half an hour. So I want to ask your thoughts on what folks can do and what gives you hope these days.
What gives me hope are the demographic changes taking place in the country. There's a new consciousness afoot, and it's growing and changing. And I have never been a pessimist. Couldn't do this work for the last 4 decades if I'd started off with a defeatist mindset. I always tell people that if you want to know where we are, look at where we were, and that'll give you a sense of the direction. People tell me, "Oh, you think the glass is half full and it's really half empty," or whatever. And I say, no, I remember when we didn't have a glass. I remember when we couldn't get in the room to have the conversation. Now we're having the conversation and we're winning. And we're winning it step by step. It's very slow. I wish we had won 30 years ago. We could have avoided a hell of a lot of suffering. I wish we'd won 60 years ago, 70 years ago. We would have avoided even more suffering. But the point is, progress is being made today. And young people in particular are making a huge impact. Do we have, as an oldster who's been in this game for a while, do we have lessons to teach? And should young people be like listening to like where, it's like history didn't begin yesterday. It didn't begin with Bernie Sanders 2020. It actually began, a long time ago. And we have to learn the lessons of the past, but my generation also has to listen to the new awareness and consciousness of youth today. And the synthesis of those, I think, is what gives me hope. I'm seeing great things happen. And what can people do? Basically, it's just keep doing what you're doing. I mean, joining groups that make a difference, joining groups that sort of put your goals into action. You can have all the great consciousness in the world, but if you're not doing something to actualize it, it means nothing. I was actually looking at, sorry to get a religious tone in here, but I was looking at something in the Epistle of James where he says to his believers in the early church, he says, you can talk about your concern about the poor, and your concern about the hungry, and your concern about the those who have no shelter. And then when the poor, homeless, hungry guy leaves you, and all you say to him is, good luck, and I hope you do well, you've done nothing. The point is you have to do something to feed that person and help that person and change the realities around that person. And that's the issue here, is that having a good idea doesn't mean anything if you're not doing something to actualize it. And groups like the 90 who signed that statement that you're talking about, They're all groups committed to making change, and people want to join CODEPINK, join all the other groups to actualize new consciousness and make it a political force. I think we're winning. I think we're getting stronger. And I think all it needs is for more of us to just put our shoulders behind the whatever that expression is, and to just get in the game and do it. I'm seeing my community grow. I mean, there were a time when Arab Americans couldn't get in the room. We couldn't be recognized. We got money given back. Our endorsements were rejected. That doesn't happen anymore. And it's a big deal. Listen, you gave your little plug. I'll give mine. If people want to follow me on Twitter, I do a lot of this conversation on Twitter. It's JJZ1600. And they can get my email and write me from there. I'd be happy to take questions I didn't take now, and have folks get into a discussion with me about issues that they care about. So thanks a lot very much, Ariel, and I really appreciated the chance to talk to folks today.
So I love your closing in the call to move this conversation to Twitter, and I encourage folks, because we did have questions coming in, but we were only able to get to so many of them, to move this conversation to Twitter and ask Jim your questions there. And I also want to have you tell folks how they can access your blog, support
Sure.
your organization. If you can just give one more plug before we close.
If they write to Zogby, JZOGBY at AAIUSA.org. Actually, I have a conversation like this every Wednesday with people who read my column. And tomorrow's, we call it Coffee and Column with Jim. Tomorrow's discussion at 2 o'clock is about the platform. It's a continuation of this conversation. So if people want to get on that list, jzogby at AAIUSA.org. Thanks a lot.
Great, and I'll see folks there. Thank you so much for joining us, and so much appreciation for all of your work.
Thanks.